Did you know that thousands of authors across the country have written books and published them with Page Publishing? If you've written a book, Page Publishing can help you through the process. We cut through the confusion of the publishing world to make it easy for you. If we decide to publish your book, your work ends and ours begins. From copy editing and proofing to typesetting and book cover art, we get you printed, distributed, and sold on Amazon, Apple iTunes, and in bookstores across the country. We'll even help you promote your book. That's right, we do all this for you. Biography, self-help, mystery, novels, sci-fi, even a children's book. No matter what genre, Page Publishing can bring your book to life. Call today for your free author submission kit and find out how you can be the next published author at Page Publishing.
Call for your free author submission kit at 855-993-2114. That's 855-993-2114.
When I grow up, I want to work for a woke company, like super woke.
When I grow up,
I want to be hired based on what I look like rather than my skills.
I want to be judged
By my political beliefs. I want to get promoted
based on my chromosomes. When I grow up,
I want to be offended
by my coworkers
and walk around the office
on eggshells
and have my words policed
by HR. Words like
grandfather,
peanut gallery,
long time no see,
no can do.
When I grow up,
I want to be obsessed with emotional safety and do workplace sensitivity training all day long. When I grow up, I want to climb the corporate ladder
just by following the crowd.
I want to be a conformist.
I want to weaponize my pronouns. What are pronouns?
It's time to grow up and get back to work. Introducing the #1 woke-free job board in America, redballoon.work.
Welcome to Making Sense of the Madness. I am Jason Burmis, and for the next hour, we're going to be spending it with Derek Brose of theconsciousresistance.com. We're going to be talking about a landmark fluoridation in the water case that, you guessed it, the mainstream media has almost completely ignored. And not just the mainstream. Haven't heard much about it in the alternative either. So you're not going to want to miss this one. Buckle up and get ready to make sense of the madness. We are back. My guest is Derek Brose. He is a friend of the program. Derek, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've been doing independent journalism for a very long time. I know that you've been covering this fluoridation case for quite some time. It just came to a conclusion. First of all, let my audience know who you are, how you got into this, and then kind of give us an overview of this case and how it turned out.
So my name is Derek Brose. First off, thanks for having me back on, Jason. And for those who aren't familiar with my work, as Jason said, you can find me at theconsciousresistance.com. I've been doing activism, independent journalism since 2010, late 2009. And covering a lot of different topics. Over the years, I've produced documentaries about Epstein, the Finders Cult. I've been on Jason's programs numerous times for these topics. And of course, following, Julian Assange, many other important stories here. But as far as fluoride goes, fluoride is actually, and water fluoridation and the dangers posed by this practice is one of the first things I started to wake up to back in 2010. I will credit Alex Jones and the posters back then. You remember them, Jason. There's poison in the tap water. One of the first forms of activism I did actually involved going around my neighborhood and putting up those posters. And then a couple of days later, noticing somebody tore them down and being like, oh, I'm going to go do it again. And so, to kind of come from that, it does feel like full circle to now be one of the only journalists. But in fact, in San Francisco, I was just in San Francisco for 2 weeks reporting on the second phase of the lawsuit. And I was one of only 2 journalists there. The only other one that was there was from Children's Health Defense. And so it's just 2 of us. And as you said, not a lot of reporting from the alternative and pretty much zero at all reporting from the mainstream. The only thing has been a few kind of legal blogs, Law 360, Bloomberg Law, but nothing really mainstream big. And so I've cared about this issue for quite some time. In terms of the water fluoride lawsuit we're talking about today, this is a historic federal lawsuit that was filed by the Fluoride Action Network, Moms Against Fluoridation, the Food and Water Watch, and then several plaintiffs, essentially just mothers who recognized that their children were, they were particularly dealing with harm from water fluoridation. So they filed this petition against the EPA in 2016 under what's called TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. And this law was passed years ago, and it allows regular people, citizens, to petition the EPA if you believe there is a substance, a chemical compound that is toxic. You provide the evidence, and there's a process you go through. And so that's what they did. They provided data, which has been out now for years, showing that fluoride is linked to neurotoxic development, and it affects cognitive development, and particularly the loss of IQ in children when mothers who are pregnant are exposed to it. So prenatal and postnatal. So they presented their evidence and they filed this petition. The EPA denied the petition. This was back in 2016, 2017. And so they countersued, they filed a lawsuit, and it's been sort of moving slowly through the courts for years. And the first phase was summer 2020. Of course, it was COVID, so everything was locked down. It was just on Zoom. There was some different hearings, and I was reporting at the time for the Last American Vagabond. And then now, just recently, in the beginning of late January, February, we've been now through the second phase, which just concluded this week. And now it is in the hands of this federal judge to decide the future of water fluoridation in the United States.
So let's talk about this process. As you said, this is filed all the way back in 2016. You can make some claims that the court system was a little bit gummed up in the past few years during COVID-19 84, but you were talking about several years before this thing was even taken off. The trial has now concluded almost 8 years later. What can we expect via a verdict? How much power is in the hand of this judge? What recourse is there if this judge does not give a favorable decision? And why is it not in the hands of a jury?
Yeah, so this is an interesting lawsuit, and I say historic, and I don't use that word lightly, and unprecedented for numerous reasons. One of them being that this is the first time that a citizen's petition under TSCA has ever made it to a federal court, so that makes it kind of historic. It's also the first time a federal court is hearing evidence of the harms of water fluoridation in the United States. So it's kind of already unprecedented just on that alone. But essentially, the TSCA process, I think it requires it to go like this to what's called a bench trial, where this judge gets to decide. So it's not a jury of the peers. The judge is basically supposed to decide, did the EPA correctly deny the plaintiff's petition, which the EPA says, hey, you guys don't have enough evidence to prove that water fluoridation at 0.7 milligrams per liter, which is what's currently recommended by the CDC, you don't have enough data to prove that at that level it is causing neurodevelopmental harm. So they denied the petition. And now it's the judge, his job to decide on if that's true. And this is another reason why it is a historic trial, because we don't typically see situations where scientists, especially government scientists, the work of those scientists is questioned by a judge. You know, the courts typically, they stay out of science, but in this case, the judge has had to learn a whole lot. You know, I can say from 2020 to now 2024, Judge Edward Chin, he seems to be as neutral as you would want to be. You know, there's all kinds of problems we know about the criminal justice system, the legal system, the courts. But in terms of, you know, this is the system we got. And if you're going to deal with that for the moment, you would want a judge who would appear to be as neutral as possible. And that's what he seems to be. He hasn't been favoring the government and just, no, it's clearly he's going to side for them. And he hasn't really been favoring the Fluoride Action Network. He's been very neutral. He's been stopping the proceedings periodically and saying, hold on, I'm confused. Can you explain to me what this means? Because they're throwing out terms like point of departure, margin of exposure, benchmark analysis, all these sorts of things that are jargony and in relation to fluoride. So I've been in there every day live tweeting and writing articles for TLAV about this. And the judge is equally sitting there trying to keep up with it because he knows, and it's been mentioned several times during the proceedings, how big his ruling on this. Because if he does rule in the favor of the plaintiffs, it could be the beginning of the end of water fluoridation in the United States. Not only if that ruling would send shockwaves, even if we could expect the EPA to appeal the decision. And if they did win the appeal, then, you know, there's still some more steps. But if they were to lose an appeal or decide not to appeal, then what would happen is the EPA under TSCA would then be forced to do what's called a rulemaking process and basically decide, okay, how do we proceed? The judge has ordered us to, you know, find this to be a neurotoxin. And they have 6 different options they could do. The only 2 that really apply in this situation would be either banning it, which is what makes sense, or lowering it, regulating it to some degree. So that's sort of where we're at now. And as I mentioned, both the EPA and the Fluoride Action Network have rested their cases. They brought expert witnesses for each side to San Francisco. And then the judge asked a bunch of questions, and they had closing arguments just yesterday and just this week. And now it's in his hands. So he's taken time to review all the various exhibits, all the expert testimony, and we can expect the decision within weeks to months. But what I'd like to share today, throughout today's show, in terms of fluoride, is just some of the details that came out throughout this lawsuit. Because I know a lot of people, maybe in this audience, are, yeah, we all know fluoride's a poison. But even though we've known that, and the data has been out there, there has been some really big, juicy details that have come out through these proceedings. And since it's not getting much attention, there's really nobody getting this information. So I want to get that to your audience today.
Absolutely. Now, before we even get there, I think it's important to know, first of all, I'm not in love, even if a judge is being fair, for this to be put in the hands of one person. I would really like to see a jury trial. That being said, I also like to see an honest media attend these type of trials so they can do the type of reporting that you're doing right now and tell me whether or not you think that this judge is actually being fair. Secondly, even if we get this ruling within the next several weeks, it seems to me that this process is probably a few years away from conclusion, because inevitably on both sides there will be appeal no matter what the judgment is. If it's the Fluoride Action Network that wins, I guarantee the EPA is appealing. If the EPA wins, I guarantee the Fluoride Action Network is appealing. And then the other thing of concern to me, and maybe the utmost concern, is obviously this is a practice that has been going on the vast majority, if not all of our lifetimes. It has been completely and totally normalized. And if in fact it is found to be harmful, there will be no criminal consequences for anybody. So this is simply for, I believe, not only monetary consequences, but regulation after the fact. So what are those monetary consequences? And the regulation after the fact, you just alluded to the fact that if there is what seems to be a coherent ruling on this, we would not be regulating it down. No, we'd be removing it altogether. Yeah. So what are your thoughts about that, Derek?
So at the moment, there is not any monetary damages being sought for this. Even though there are, as I mentioned, there are some mothers who are part of this, and they in their filings and their original lawsuit, they do mention various harm that they think has come to their children because of this. But that's because at the moment, in order to be able to sue the EPA, you have to have standing, and now they have standing. They filed a petition, they were denied. But I do think if it does find in the favor of the Fluoride Action Network and their plaintiffs, what you said is very true. And I think this is one of the reasons why, if there are these forces, I'm going to share more about what some of these expert witnesses told me, because there definitely are, there's a fluoride lobby, let's say. I think that what they're concerned of, if not terrified of, is that the judge finds that, yes, fluoride has been shown to be a neurotoxin, the EPA must ban it, right? Well, then you have to imagine what happens with the American Dental Association, the CDC, the FDA, and all the other organizations who have been promoting fluoride for the last 80 years. And what about parents who all of a sudden start asking, did my child lose a couple of IQ points because of drinking fluoride when I was pregnant? Is my hip bone related to fluoride exposure? Is my thyroid problems related to that? My liver, kidney? Because these are all the different things that fluoride attacks and really destroys in your body. So there could be class action lawsuits like something we've never seen before. And not only that, of course, there are the companies, the aluminum phosphate mining industry, which is where this toxic waste comes from. At the moment, they get to sign lucrative contracts for cities around the United States and make money instead of having to pay money to dispose of this waste. So you can imagine they still have some interest in trying to keep this from going in the favor of the people. And as I think I mentioned a moment ago, this was something the judge alluded to a few different times in court. Like, he understood that, because there was basically government attorneys there in person, and then there was Fluoride Action Network supporters and people like myself who were there kind of documenting, following along, but really just two journalists. And so the judge knows, and it was on Zoom, and they're still discussing whether or not they're going to release the recordings so people can see it themselves, since it's a historic case. The judge recognizes that, like, there's a lot of weight on the decision he makes, and that the government, I mean, honestly, on the closing arguments this week, I'd never seen the EPA's attorney as flustered as I saw him, because in this last final closing arguments, the judge definitely seemed to be leaning in the favor of the Fluoride Action Network. You know, the attorneys were essentially trying to say, their whole argument has been, it's too uncertain, Judge. Yeah, we have some data showing that there's lower IQ exposure because of fluoride exposure, but then we got this other data that says, you know, you can't really tell anything. And they pulled up one study in the last year, which is very shady. This study that claims that fluoride actually increases IQ points by 15. The government brought that to the table. So they're just trying to confuse the judge. That has been the goal of their witnesses, is just to everything the Fluoride Action Network presents and their expert witnesses, the government will come in and say, yeah, but what about this, and this thing? And by the end, the judge, I think their hope is that he's just so confused and he's like, you know what, there's too much uncertainty. I'm going to, just say, no, sorry, we need more studies, and kick the can further down the road. That's what the EPA was arguing all week, but they're ignoring the mountains of data that is here. And they're ignoring the fact that because of this lawsuit, we have emails. I think I've shared this with you in past shows, but we have emails that have come out showing that Assistant Health Secretary Rachel/Richard Levine is named in these emails as having blocked the release of a U.S. government National Toxicology Program report, which was supposed to come out in May 2022. And because of this lawsuit and because of their ability to file for records, they were able to get access to these emails. And now we see that behind the scenes, while these U.S. government scientists said, hey, our report's ready, we're ready to publish May 2022, the CDC's Oral Health Division and the HHS were communicating saying, no, this report's not coming out. And the judge did allow that information into evidence. They couldn't discuss the politics of it, but he said even though it was only the draft form, he would allow it in. And it's this report, this U.S. government National Toxicology report, that says higher fluoride exposure is associated with lower IQ in children. And this is the report they don't want people to see. And this is why they're doing their best to keep this story out of the public's eye.
I can't believe that Admiral Levine would have that high level of corruption. Rachel / whatever it was before, seems like the utmost in character and really what we want in the military industrial complex. We got to take a break, but when we come back, I kind of want to talk about the absurdity of the idea that this is healthy and helps IQ. It kind of reminds me of that old school local media piece that went out nationally, how mercury in vaccines may help, not harm your children's brain activity and IQ. And folks, I could not make that up. That was really there. And then one of the other aspects that I want to talk about is the commercial industries that utilize fluoride. Obviously, the toothpaste industry being one, and then hit on what this fluoride actually is, because you mentioned something a lot of people aren't aware of. A lot of these people that provide this fluoride would otherwise have to dispose of it because it's actually a toxic chemical when in high concentrations. It is making sense of the madness. We are with Derek Broze of theconsciousresistance.com, and we'll be back after this.
The world is about to shift. Banks are going cashless globally with the emergence of central bank digital currency, which will bring with it programmable money and the ability to turn on or off your purchasing power based on your digital social profile. It's like the equivalent of spyware in your bank account. You need to get out of the system with the world's safest and most private assets, silver and gold.
Call Kirk Elliott, PhD at 877-547-5743. That's 877-KIRK-PhD.
We are back with Derek Broze of theconsciousresistance.com. Now, just prior, Derek, you were talking about the industry aspect of this. Now, a lot of people are unaware that fluoride is actually several different things. In other words, you have a natural occurring calcium fluoride that can be found in some bodies of water. In fact, when I used to get the Saratoga drinking water, that had a natural calcium fluoride supply. But that's not what's used in the vast majority of fluoridated products, including our water, is it?
No, it's not. And, to that point, before we get into that, I think that it's important for people to know that even some of the studies that were presented in this case and the ones that the NTP report that I mentioned a moment ago studied involve involve exposure to naturally occurring fluoride. So all types of fluoride appear to cause some harm to the human body. But the one we're dealing with in this lawsuit, and the one that most people would be familiar with, simply known as fluoride, is some type of hydrofluorosilicic acid or hydrofluoric acid. There's a couple different compounds in that family, but they all come from this aluminum phosphate mining.
So what was being done with this fluoride prior to it being put in the water supply? Because, you mentioned Alex Jones, and I remember when I was over at Infowars.com, one of the first things that Rob Dew, probably their longest standing producer at this point, did was go to the water fluoridation plant there and very clearly show that you literally had the death's head warning on the bags of fluoride that would then be dispersed into the water supply. So what was being done with this stuff prior?
Yeah, so there really is an important history that people need to know. For those who want to go super deep, I will right off the bat encourage you to check out a book called The Fluoride Deception by journalist Christopher Bryson, which was released in the early 2000s. But when you look at the history of this, as I mentioned, 80-year-old practice, it didn't come from this Disney version of events. The Disney version, the sort of CDC version, is that in the 40s, the CDC and the government discovered that people in rural areas, teeth was not doing too good, but then in people with naturally occurring fluoride, their teeth seemed to be doing better. And so they commissioned some studies and they found out, wow, fluoride hardens the teeth, it reduces cavities, it does all these wonderful things, and let's start fluoridating in mass. And that's where we're at now. And as I said, it's listed still on the CDC's website as the top 10 public health achievement of the 20th century. But the real story, as I've been learning more and more, as I mentioned, I've been researching this for over a decade, but I haven't looked at fluoride in a few years. And I felt like I got even more of a kind of lowdown history throughout the last couple of weeks of the trial. The real story goes back to the Manhattan Project and to the U.S. nuclear program. When they were studying uranium, they were also studying what happens when people are exposed to fluoride. You can also go back to a Danish scientist named Kai Roholm, who in the 1930s, he went to Greenland and was studying mining workers in these mineral mines for what's called cryolite. And apparently when you are mining cryolite, fluoride is released in the process. And so these mining workers have been exposed to it in pretty strong amounts. And so Kai Roholm went there, studied them, did x-rays, did all kinds of tests on them. And in 1937, almost 100 years ago, he wrote a book all about it. He was the person to discover skeletal fluorosis, that being overexposed to fluoride. He said that when they did x-rays, the men's rib cages were like marble. You couldn't even see through it with an x-ray machine. And at the same time, they were very brittle. So my point with saying all this is this didn't just pop up one day and all of a sudden the ADA thought, hey, we're going to cure cavities. And, again, the Disney version of events. There was a very deliberate effort by the U.S. government. Once a few incidents happened, there's one in Jersey, a few other places where these aluminum phosphate factories, they're supposed to have these scrubbers at the top that catch the fluoride and catch the toxins so they're not released. Well, there was a couple of accidents in Jersey and elsewhere where they did get out and spill into some neighborhoods. And there's reports, you can find the digital newspaper clippings of these, of farmers, their cattle being killed, their crops being killed. And this led to lawsuits. And some of it, again, was related to because they were starting to study it for nuclear purposes. And the government preempted. They knew that there were going to be lawsuits and they said, we need to get some studies out basically to make fluoride look good so that once these farmers tried to file lawsuits, they had some reference points to point to, which I think is what they're still doing now with this. Oh, fluoride raises IQ by 15 points. But, long story short, again, look up the fluoride deception. This is not what you've been told. The CDC, it's here to help your teeth. It's here to lower cavities. And in fact, just this week, new studies are coming out in the UK showing that there is no measurable difference for cavities between people who are fluoridated and non-fluoridated. So all of these myths we've been sold about fluoride are not true.
So maybe what's most alarming about these studies in that time period is that association with the Manhattan Project, because for those that do not understand the significance outside of the fact that it created the nuclear bomb, it was really the archetype for compartmentalization and how our military-industrial complex would be run after the fact in World War II, where you had a multitude of people working on a program and only a minutia of that populace actually having any idea what they were actually working on. And when you are working with biological entities like fluoride, or maybe even viruses, or things that occur in labs or government study, and you have this type of classification and compartmentalization, you end up getting a house of cards based on lies, but also this plausible deniability cycle where these entities seem to be able to manufacture their narrative via the trust the science and their experts. So this is a playbook that didn't just start during the COVID 1984 nightmare. In fact, if you want to follow it back in this country, you certainly can follow it back to that World War II era.
Absolutely. And you know, besides the historical aspects we just shared, if we could, Jason, I'd like to share just a couple of quotes directly from the scientists that are interviewed, because again, I'm there as a journalist, I'm documenting, but somebody might say, okay, well, this guy is not a scientist, right? Why should I listen to him? The CDC is still telling me this is good, or maybe that's what you're going to hear from a family member. So if you don't mind, I just want to read a couple of these quotes from some of the Fluoride Action Network's experts that they told to me directly. The first one, his name is Dr. Howard Hu. He was involved in this Mexico study called the Element Study, which looked at pregnant mothers who were being exposed to fluoride. And he also, his work has been, he's been seen as one of the experts with lead toxicity. The EPA has used some of his work to help develop their standards on lead toxicity. So I asked him just straight up, like, what are your thoughts on whether fluoride is a neurotoxin and the data that shows that? And he told me, quote, yes, I would say that in my view, the evidence is quite persuasive that there is a negative impact of fluoride exposure on the neurodevelopment of children, particularly the research that's been coming out in prenatal exposure. The second witness I got to talk to was Dr. Bruce Lanphier, who is from University of Missouri. He's worked again with the EPA. So, I mean, this was the interesting thing, is the Fluoride Action Network's experts were people that actually have been hired by and worked with the EPA. And again, in this case, Dr. Bruce Lanphier also worked on the EPA's worked on lead toxicity, and it's his work that the EPA used to develop their standards. So I was talking to him about pregnant mothers and their exposure to this, and how, you know, what I was basically being told is that as the baby progresses through the mom and the baby progress through the trimester, by the third trimester, when she's drinking more water, if she's drinking fluoridated water, of course, the concentration is going to increase in her urine, and the baby, it's going to pass through the placenta, through the blood-brain barrier. But also by the time you get to that third trimester and the baby's starting to pull calcium out of its mother's body to try to make its own skeletal structure, fluoride stores in your bones. So the baby will be pulling the fluoride directly out of the mother's bones and into its own body. So, I mean, that's another disturbing thing. But Dr. Lanphier told me mainly about hypothyroidism. And so I just want to read this. He said, quote, what we found is that women who are exposed to higher amounts of fluoride, especially if it's in the water or if it's a measure of fluoride intake, we saw an increased risk of these women developing hypothyroidism. And he said, what we saw, it wasn't a small amount. Overall, there's about 65% increase in hypothyroidism. And he said it raises really important questions. And finally, the last witness I just want to share, Dr. Philippe Grandjean. This is the Danish scientist who his work was helped the U.S. government develop their standards for mercury. So again, these guys have expertise in dealing with toxins and toxicity, and have been used by the government time and time again because their work is that strong. And so I asked him about some of these similar topics, but I wanted to share from him is that he, in 2020, he said under oath in court that he had been threatened by Harvard because he worked at Harvard. He said when he started to work on water fluoridation, somebody threatened him there. And then he also said that in his words, the fluoride lobby had infiltrated the World Health Organization. So I hadn't heard anybody else follow up with that. When I finally got to meet him this year, just a couple of weeks ago, I asked him, and my interview's on my website, and I asked him, can you elaborate on what that means? And this is what he told me. He says, quote, a professor from Harvard came to my office and asked me to sign a statement that my work on fluoride had nothing to do with water fluoridation. He actually wrote this draft, and since I didn't sign it immediately, he went to my dean and had the dean sign a statement saying that he supported water fluoridation in accordance with the CDC. And he said that the leadership at Harvard told him that his research was unwanted. And then he said, quote, because we couldn't agree on what I would consider my academic freedom, I left Harvard. And then the final thing he told me, I asked him, I said, well, what is this fluoride lobby at the WHO? Can you tell me more about that? And he was invited to actually help the WHO develop an environmental health criteria document related to water fluoridation. And so he starts gathering data, animal studies, epidemiological studies, and putting together a draft report. Well, then he said, quote, they inserted changes in my draft report indicating that fluoride could perhaps be toxic, but only at immense concentrations. I protested and I said that in accordance with the scientific documentation, it would be wrong to insert the word immense. And so the WHO published a document without my name because I asked to have my name stricken. And then they inserted some other colleague's name as the author of the draft, which is, of course, erroneous. But that was what the WHO felt was necessary in order to protect the interests of water fluoridation.
The World Health Organization, obviously a trustworthy entity that we should bend the knee to and allow our Constitution to be totally and completely eviscerated by. And boy, did they handle that pandemic #1 superstar style. We got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about some of the things that fluoridation in the water is said to do. You know, we've talked about fluorosis, skeletal structures. We've talked about neurological damage, but I really want to get into this idea of hypothyroidism. It is Making Sense of the Madness. We're with Derek Broze of theconsciousresistance.com, and we'll be back after this.
Do you have diabetes? If you have insurance, you may qualify for a new continuous glucose monitor. With a CGM, you can continuously track your levels and trends, spend more time in range, significantly lower your A1C, and share important data with loved ones and caregivers. Most importantly, a CGM eliminates the one thing most people with diabetes hate: painful finger sticks. Take charge of your health. Order your new continuous glucose monitor today. If you use insulin and have seen your diabetes care provider within the last 6 months, you may qualify for a CGM today. We'll do all the insurance paperwork and deliver your new CGM at little or no out-of-pocket cost to you. Medicare and most insurances cover continuous glucose monitors, so don't wait. Have your insurance handy and call the CGM Health Hotline now.
And we are back with Derek Broze of The Conscious Resistance. Derek, before the break, we were talking about some of the things that are alleged to occur from this fluoride supply being dumped into the water. And you were talking about literally not only mothers and children, but babies as they develop, and this hypothyroidism. What is that? What are some of the things that can occur with that? And does that have an overall impact on life expectancy and, of course, quality of life?
Yeah, so there are two. First off, your thyroid is obviously, you have a thyroid gland in your body, and there's a whole system connected to it, your glandular system, and it plays an important role. And I'm by no means an expert on it, but I do know a little bit about how particularly fluoride is related to this. So first off, hypothyroidism would be a thyroid that is not active enough, that is, maybe not producing enough, and it's just not functioning fully as much as it could. Hyperthyroidism is when it's overactive and your thyroid is just, causing problems from the other direction. And the interesting thing to know is that fluoride actually used to be given medicinally for people with hyperthyroidism because it's been known that it suppresses the thyroid. So that's one thing to know, that this data has already been out there. That's what makes it more frustrating as well, that mothers and people, children, babies are being exposed to this stuff. And the data's all been there. But so hypothyroidism can lead to, the reason they mentioned it in this trial, because again, the trial is very specifically focused on neurocognitive development. That's what they're trying to prove. So in this case, they were talking about how once the thyroid is affected, it affects all kinds of things, but it can particularly affect your cognitive abilities. You can start getting brain fog and all kinds of other things over time from your thyroid being messed up. And not only that, but fluoride does displace the iodine in the body as well. And so that causes problems with the thyroid. And all over, as I mentioned earlier, it just seems like a full frontal assault on the body's various systems and various organs.
So again, you've been in the courtroom. What were some of the other things that surprised you? And again, somebody who's been following this for some time, well over a decade, it takes a lot for the shock and awe of some of us. Although we're in some pretty weird times in 2024, I still find myself being taken aback by a lot of what's going on. But in regards to this case, what were some of the shockers?
So, I mean, in addition to what I've already shared, I will say there was another really, I think, important moment that happened. I'll mention again, we'll talk about this idea that fluoride actually increases IQ, which I think the government should feel just ridiculous trying to even bring that into court. And the judge didn't seem to take it seriously. He's just like, is there a chance there's something wrong with this study? Because all the other data is pointing either and there's nothing going on or there's harm. And all of a sudden you guys got one study saying it's helping IQ. But the other big moment, and this is one of the reasons I'm hoping that the judge does decide to release the video proceedings, and if so, I will be clipping this moment and sharing it out. But one of the government's expert witnesses is Dr. Stanley Barone, who is a senior science policy advisor for what's called the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention at the EPA. And he has been involved directly with the EPA's risk assessments under TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. So he, by all means is definitely an expert in this process. And so they brought him in there to play the role. But again, his main job seemed to be just trying to create doubt in the judge's mind. Every time the Fluoride Action Network would ask him a very simple question, he would say yes, but then he would kind of add a caveat, a long winding answer, or he would just offer a sort of non-answer. And I think that's what they coached him to do, to make it as difficult for the judge to follow. But there was a particularly telling moment, and this was on the last day, the final testimony for Dr. Barone, when Michael Connett, the Fluoride Action Network attorney, was cross-examining him. And so he asked him a couple of questions. He asked him, so you agree that there is an association of neurotoxicity with water fluoridation above levels of 2 milligrams per liter? And Barone said, yes, at some level above 2 milligrams, because this is what the government's been arguing. Okay, they're finally admitting that there is harm, but they're saying it's only at 2 milligrams. It's way above the 0.7 milligrams recommended by the U.S., so you can't use this data. It's not relevant. It doesn't apply here. But in every other case, like say with lead and mercury, the EPA, they didn't just say, okay, well, harm starts at 2 milligrams, so we're going to do nothing about it before then. They assumed that there was harm happening before then, and they erred on the side of caution, and they, banned, get the lead out of the pipes and mercury and all these things. But in the case of fluoride, they're not taking that same procedure, and that's what Michael Connett was trying to show. So Michael Connett began questioning Barone about this concentration of fluoride in the body and talking specifically about the kidney and how people who already have like thyroid issues or have kidney problems, that their body is already having trouble detoxing things and that fluoride will build up in their body. So he just kept drilling him about this, asking him this over and over and over. And he finally got like a great way to ask it. And he said, quote, you testified earlier today that there may be saturation going on in the kidney at the 95th percentile level in fluoridated areas. Do you feel comfortable as a risk assessor scientist exposing pregnant women to a level of fluoride that is so high that their kidney is oversaturated? And when he asked this question, the entire courtroom was silent. Dr. Barone just sat there, and I think he was totally stunned because at least 5 to 7 seconds passed of silence in the courtroom. The judge noticed that everybody's just looking at him like, did he hear the question? Is he going to answer? And in the end, he again offers some long winding, I don't know. And then he ended up just saying, my opinion is not germane to the topic. Basically saying like my opinion as an expert, even though I'm on the stand as an expert witness, it's not relevant what I think. And it was just a beautiful moment to see that he knew that the answer wasn't going to be good, and he just sat there in silence. And it definitely had an impact on the judge for sure.
Well, he didn't want to give an honest answer, and he certainly did not want to give a direct answer that would expose that dishonesty. So as you said, a lot of these people that are witnesses for the government and corporations and people in interests of power are often coached on how to talk around the question continuously, and we're seeing this more and more in our court system. It is somewhat heartening that you believe and you perceive that the judge is taking note. He is going down the line. He does not seem to be favoring any other sides. As you said, within the next several weeks, we can expect that ruling. Will you be contacted before that ruling takes place? What kind of a hearing are we talking about? And then, basically what happens directly after? Are we just kind of beholden to the appeals process after that ruling?
So I asked this question to Michael Conant, like what comes next if, at the end of this, and basically it is in the judge's hands. The judge could take days, more expecting more like weeks, could be months, but hopefully, weeks, because he said several times he recognizes that while the court is not ruling if fluoride is a toxin, as we know it is, people are still being exposed to this. So I think he is in somewhat of a, he's feeling the pressure to act soon. And I am, because of the Fluoride Action Network, they're going to let me know as soon as we have some sort of ruling. I'm not sure if there's going to be another hearing, like there will be an opportunity for everybody hearing this to jump on Zoom and hear what he actually says, if he's going to issue a public ruling, or if it's just going to be posted, and then we'll find out after the fact. But if you guys follow me at Conscious Resistance or TLAV, Last American Vagabond, I will continue reporting and writing articles about that the moment we have some updates about it. And again, as far as all those quotes I was sharing, if anybody wants to hear more about that, the interviews are on the consciousresistance.com under my water fluoridation category. You can check out all those and just kind of dive deeper into the words of the scientists. Because, it's interesting, man. Like I mentioned, this has been a topic I've been aware of, like many of us, since early days. But I do feel like a sense of kind of reinvigoration to get this information out to people. That's why I've been doing so many interviews to try to spread the word where I can, because it's just even more confirmation that women, babies, people are being exposed, they're being harmed. And according to Dr. Grandjean's research, he's saying it only takes a couple of full liters of fluoridated water to start affecting cognitive development. So this isn't like you need to drink fluoride for 50 years to see an effect. It's like it's impacting you already the moment you're consuming it. If you're eating processed foods, sodas, if you go out to eat, more than likely that's fluoridated water. It's in some pesticides. That's the other big thing about this lawsuit is they're focused. The government is trying to keep the judge just focused on water fluoridation and say it doesn't matter about all these other exposures. But realistically, the judge is trying to think about, well, what are people actually being exposed to? They're not being just exposed to the water or being exposed to all these other, all the other exposures of fluoride. So when you put that together, it is just a cocktail of nasty stuff, and we need to put an end to it. Hopefully the judge does what's right. If not, I guess we just go back to trying to continue to fight it on the local level. There's more and more people having success in that way, but this ruling could save us all a lot of time, to say the least.
And, I do want to get into that local level aspect, but first I kind of want to hit on what you just said. You go out to eat. More than likely, the water that you get is fluoridated water, and they're cooking and boiling things with that fluoridated water. And even if you're taking every single step you possibly can in your own home, chances are you're showering in that fluoridated water. You go out anywhere. This is something that on some level it is almost nearly impossible to get around on every single level. It's something that we automatically have to acquiesce to in our daily lives. So when you look on what this anti-fluoridation network has been able to achieve and accomplish with this court case, what are some of the do's and don'ts, the positives and negatives, the things that we can look to take action ourselves, and what would you suggest as a blueprint for others to get involved locally?
Sure. So I'm going to share a book. This is written by a gentleman named Clint Grice. Sorry, Clint, I don't know how to pronounce your name, but he sent me this book a while back. It's called Something in the Water, 12 Steps to Ending Fluoridation in Your Town. And I actually got to meet him in person at the lawsuit, the court in San Francisco. And I think this is a great place to start. Again, it's called Something in the Water, 12 Steps to Ending Fluoridation in Your Town. I don't make any money off that. I'm just offering this because Clint interviewed people from all over the world who've been fighting this fluoridation fight and took, the best tips and ideas from them. And I think that's a great resource. I started a Fluoride Free Houston group back in Houston, Texas, and more than a decade ago. We started going to city council. We started showing up and giving them studies and all this stuff. And we had a particularly difficult fight in Houston because of the way the local government set up. But it has happened. There are 2 different cities in Texas that have banned fluoridation. Just this last week, I heard that there was a new county in Florida that just banned water fluoridation. So people are having some impact. You just got to go. You got to speak to them. It's a long fight. I mean, don't expect that, I got the science, I'm going to show up and they're all just going to immediately end water fluoridation. Like, it's not going to be that easy. And unfortunately, The pro-fluoridation lobby is very organized, and I'm telling you this, they will show up, even if you're just a couple of guys in some small town and you don't think anybody's paying attention. The next thing you know, the ADA sends people to your city council. It happened with us. There are these pro-fluoridation groups that follow any resistance to fluoride, and they'll write notes to the editor in your town. They'll show up for council meetings. And so just be aware of that. There will be opposition. There is definitely a vested special interest group, the fluoride lobby, as Dr. Groungen called it, that does not want this practice to end. So just, have some patience. If we have to go back to local fights, which I plan to try, again, use my interviews with these scientists, take the quotes from them, take it to your city council, say, this isn't me, this is a scientist here with all this experience. We have to fight where we can. Hopefully this court case, wins, and then it's gone over at the federal level. And then within a couple of years, it's over and done. Or sooner, hopefully. But if not, then I think we got to go back to fighting and pushing on our local level, see if you can hold your town council, city council, and those kind of local officials accountable and educate them. And some of them are just going to toe the CDC line, unfortunately, and some of them might be willing to listen.
We got to take a break. When we come back, I want to shift gears a little bit. I want to talk Epstein. Derek Broze is one of the few people out there that's really done the deep dives and the research into the Jeffrey Epstein case. And he was one of the few people like myself that wasn't expecting much from this latest data dump, because guess what? We'd already seen the vast majority of the documents. We got to take that break. We'll be back after this with more Making Sense of the Madness.
Listen, if we even think you owe us money, you won't know what hit you. We'll put liens on everything you own. Raid your bank accounts, retirement fund, pension. You'll open up your paycheck and cry because we'll already have the money. We'll haul you into federal court and you might even go to jail. Hey, it's our job.
Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. Our experts will fight for you using IRS guidelines to stop any IRS actions like bank levies or wage garnishments. Plus, eliminate penalties and interest and reduce your past tax bill so you pay the IRS less. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a tax doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
I'd have my mom call the number on the screen. You come see me alone. We'll work it out. Really, we will.
Back with Derek Broze, a short segment of the show. Derek, you've been following the Epstein case for quite some time. We actually ended up on a Twitter space together of a rather popular one. I always Mario Nafal or whatever, but it's not really him. It's like a group of people, but they have big spaces. And we were talking about the Epstein case, and one of the points that both you and I were really trying to drive home during this is the vast majority of this information has already been publicly available, and there is no list. That is imagination land. There's no client list, and the fact of the matter is the evidence strongly suggests that the FBI has had a lot of this blackmail material for some time in the forms of photographs, videos, burned DVDs, and hard drives. That's all on the record. So, in the next 4 or 5 minutes, what was your overview and real take of this latest Epstein drop?
Well, I think you had it right there. I mean, again, we were on that space, and I'm grateful to whoever's with Mario Nafal's team that reached out to me for the invitation. But I see some of those people on X, Twitter, as kind of what Ike recently termed the mainstream alternative media, or what I sometimes call this great inversion or this fake awakening. I don't trust Tucker Carlson and people like that. I think there's a lot of these new folks that, whether intentionally or not, they're coming in kind of late. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody wakes up at different points. But they were sort of expecting some big bombshell from the Epstein documents. And not only that, but the sloppiness of the reporting, which in my view just adds fuel to the mainstream talking points of Twitter is just a disinformation space. And, they're letting fake news spread. And in some cases, it's true. There's people out there spreading fake information. They got millions of followers. And they're saying oh, the Epstein client list just dropped. It's like, this wasn't a client list. It had nothing to do, they don't take the time to actually dig into what's actually going on. And so it feeds into false, just false expectations where people think like, oh my God, we're about to get something big. And most people just have sort of a basic, really basic understanding of the Epstein story and don't understand, no, this is one case and one lawsuit of one victim and, not anything to do with a particular client list or anything like that. So that's sad to see. And that was the only reason I did go on a few of those spaces. Some of them were pretty big. I think Jones joined one of them, was to just kind of throw that out there. Like, hey, I'm glad we're able to do this on Twitter or whatever and have, 30,000 people listening, but there's nothing new here. There's nothing to really write home about. Like if you've been paying attention and if you've watched your reporting or my documentary I put out in 2018 called Bringing Down Jeffrey Epstein, everything was in there. I mean, it's basically this sort of rehashing. There's some minor details here and there, but for the most part, it's just gossip is kind of where we're at. We're not getting anything new. We're not getting, like you mentioned, the DVDs or the video recordings or the stuff that the victims themselves have said existed, that we know existed in the house, that we know the FBI collected. And I don't expect ever to. Instead, I think there's going to be people who keep getting confused when a new lawsuit comes out and maybe there's, again, like some documents get released and we learn somebody's name. But what does it tell us? Ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going to take the law of the United States that everybody is assumed innocent until proven guilty. So being in Epstein's, black book or being named in a lawsuit or being accused of anything doesn't necessarily mean you did anything. So unless people are going to go just start accusing, celebrities and other people, everybody who's named with Epstein of being involved in this, and I do think there's investigations. I'm not saying don't ask questions, but at the end of the day, we just don't really know anything more than we did. And I kept saying that in the spaces, and I felt like the hosts were trying to make it much more exciting than it really was. Like, hold on, breaking. We got this new page of the document that says this thing and that thing. And it's like, yeah, I remember reporting about that 3 years ago. There wasn't anything, 5 years, 6 years ago, there wasn't anything new for the most part. So I kind of just saw it as an unfortunate example of how the worst parts of social media, promoting fake stuff like, hey, it's a client list, not really being aware of what's going on, and then just kind of hyping up stuff that really has already been out there. And it just seems like maybe they can just recycle this every couple of years and new people who've just come to the table are going to be like, oh my God, new Epstein discoveries. And, nothing new ever comes out.
And one of the things I do want to kind of reiterate is that about a year before this dump, there was some original reporting. And that's when you first heard the name Noam Chomsky and Minsky. And you also saw, which never got reported on, there's a bunch of fake print screens and dialogues about Jimmy Kimmel being in the documents. He's not. He never was. But Leonardo DiCaprio was allegedly in his Rolodex. And so was Peter Thiel in that Rolodex. And William Burns of the CIA was in that Rolodex. And these are meetings somewhere in the 2015 and 2016 region. We already know everything there is to know about Prince Andrew and him, except for the fact that they don't talk about that Prince Andrew is the UK's arms dealer at that period of time and actually cutting Libyan arms deals, all sorts of good stuff. And really for me, what I thought was at the biggest piece of quote unquote direct eyewitness evidence that came out of that was from a podcast after the fact called the They Might Be Drunk podcast, where a couple of comedians had Lewis Black on. And Lewis Black's somebody I've followed forever, but he talks about going to Epstein's house with other comedians and his manager once. And, he basically says, look, I don't have anything to hide. I went there. I was told there was going to be good wine. When we got there, there were pretty women there, but there was an older pretty woman there that I assumed was with Epstein himself. And then he goes, it was really weird. When I talked to him, he pointed to a large whiteboard. Now, if you look at some of the videos and the photographs in his homes, he did have a large whiteboard. So obviously, Lewis Black is telling the truth. And he said, Epstein told me, you know what that is? I'm like, I don't know what that is. He goes, I was talking about the weapon systems with the Israeli defense minister last night. Now, I want everybody to take it back a notch. Take it back a notch. That should have been headlines everywhere. You're not talking about Israeli defense systems. unless you're working with the Israeli Defense Department or intelligence on some level, and you're not talking about weapon systems unless you're cutting multi-billion-dollar arms deals. And this, of course, coincides with the Vicky Ward information about Epstein being intelligence, and also that what? She dropped the fact that he knew Adnan Khashoggi, who's notorious during the Iran-Contra era. And Derek, you'll get a kick out of this. I actually interviewed Conrad Black last week on this very program, forgetting that Conrad Black is the man accused of squashing the Epstein story all the way back in 2003 via Vanity Fair. And when I brought up his relationship to Robert Maxwell, he admitted that they were good buddies, and he felt that Ghislaine got a raw deal. We got to take one more break. Great conversation, as always, with Derek Broze of theconsciousresistance.com. We're going to come back. We're going to wrap it up. He's going to tell you how you can support him, his work, and really empower yourself through information via the Conscious Resistance Network. Final segment of Making Sense of the Madness after this. And we are back with Derek Broze, final segment of Making Sense of the Madness. Derek, as always, it's a pleasure to have you on the broadcast. We can talk about a multitude of issues. You know, you brought up in the very beginning Assange as a main issue. As of the recording of this program, we still do not know his fate and whether or not he will actually be extradited. Unfortunately, I think that this is where we're going, but who knows? Maybe we get the Hail Mary. In these last few minutes, what would you like to leave the audience with, and how can they support your work? And what do you think are the most important topics right now as we enter into almost the middle phase of this 2024 election cycle?
Yeah, thank you again for having me on, brother. I appreciate it. Always enjoy the conversation. Everybody can find me again at theconsciousresistance.com and thelastamericanvagabond.com, especially if you want to keep up with the fluoride lawsuit. Obviously, I've been very deep in that at the moment. I'm kind of just coming up for air finally after being focused on that. And I will continue to follow it, but you can find, all kinds of other stories there at my website. And if you want to support me, theconsciousresistance.com/invest lists my Substack, buy me a coffee, my crypto wallets, and all that good stuff. And all that is always appreciated because I don't think I mentioned this yet, but for example, the fluoride lawsuit going to San Francisco for 15 days, that was a completely crowdfunded operation by those who support through the T-Lab and through the Conscious Resistance. We raised money to cover for my hotel, my flights, and I was able to go to court for 42 hours, 5 hours a day for 9 days, and do interviews and run around and talk to people. And that was only possible because of support like people like yourself. So thank you to everybody who does choose to give to me or to Jason or any independent voices out there who are trying to do this important work. And in terms of what's coming up next and sort of what's the important issue, I think what we were chatting about a little bit earlier before we started recording is going to be interesting. This, not only OpenAI's Sora, but what you were telling me about and just AI in general. I definitely think we're going to see some deep fakes coming out this U.S. election, and not just a deep fake that comes and goes, but maybe a potential deep fake that we're told at least disrupts the election or causes some harm. I do believe we're going to see more of that popping up. We're already seeing it happen in other nations, smaller nations right now, where deep fake videos get out. They're like, oh, it cost this guy the election. So I think we're going to see more of that. This is, of course, what the Bilderberg Group told us years ago, the post-truth era that we were going to be coming into. I think we're going to see that. I also think, in terms of the election years are always a great time to divide the populace and the public, to get us fighting in the streets and screaming at each other, to get people thinking they're, neighbors or just somebody they could never get along with. I expect to see more of that, unfortunately. And I don't like to predict things, especially bad things, but I have very bad feelings about this election, as I did in the last one, whether that means election day or come inauguration day. We'll see, of course, how all the lawsuits are playing out against Trump, but I definitely do not have good feelings for what the powers that wish they were, the predator class, has for this coming year. So I just encourage everybody to, stay informed, take care of your family, get involved locally, and be ready for the bumpy ride.
Real quick, yes or no question. Is it going to be Biden versus Trump on election day?
That's a good one. I don't think Biden's going to make it, man. I don't think it's going to be Biden versus Trump. I don't know who yet, but I think the fact that we saw in the last 2 weeks with that report and then mentioning his age, and all of a sudden they're finally asking him hard questions. It was like the signal was there. They're turning on Biden. You're seeing CNN talk about Kamala now. You're seeing this at the mainstream that's been essentially saying those are right-wing talking points, finally saying, hey, maybe he is too old. So I think there's a shift. The storyline is starting to shift.
Absolutely. Derek Brose, thank you so much. As always, it is a pleasure to have you here. It's not about left or right to me. It's always about right and wrong. I absolutely love you guys, and I'll see you on the flip side.